right, folks. Well, welcome to our LandGate webinar. Pleasure to have everybody on the call. Looks like we're going to have a pretty full attendance list for this webinar. So looks like the topic is of interest to the landowners that are out there. So thanks for giving us a little bit of time today. I'm going to be your host. My name is Craig Kaiser. I'm the president and co-founder of LandGate. We are a web-based company that provides a very large amount of data and analytics to landowners, just like yourselves. If any of you have ever used Zillow to research your house or residential property, we provide very, very similar services, but on the natural resource and land ownership side. So if you have questions about any of the topics we're going to cover today and want to dive into those a little bit more, feel free to leverage LandGate. It is free for landowners and to research your own property. So feel free to go to landgate.com and go ahead and take a look at your property and see what kind of analytics we have there for you. The topic today is going to be leasing requirements for different types of natural resources. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. I have a bit of a presentation to show you. This presentation, we will be sending it out to attendees. So if you are joining late or if you want to review some other things later on, you want to come back and look at some of the topics that we covered, it's not a problem. This is going to be recorded and we will be sending that recording out. If you've joined our webinars before, we really try to push for engagement and we really enjoy having folks ask questions. We're going to do things a little bit differently this time because we have just so many people attending. What I'd like you all to do, and we have put the email addresses there. If you have questions, and I'm sure you're going to have plenty, so please ask away. That really helps me drive what type of information that we're going to put out there. But please feel free at any time to email your questions to Michaela or Jordan. Their emails are mb@landgate or je@landgate.com. They're going to put that in the chat. So at any moment you have any questions, feel free to email those in and I will get those answered live depending on how many questions are submitted. We're going to go through a brief presentation talking about the different types of resources, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So please feel free to submit those questions. If your question does not get answered during the webinar, don't worry, we'll go back through it and we will send you an email and we'll get your questions answered to the best of our abilities there. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Most likely you're here because you're a landowner or you represent a landowner, you're a real estate agent, and everybody who owns land wants to try to make a little bit more revenue on that property. A very good way to do that is leasing those resources through natural resource types of verticals. So we're going to start things out with oil and gas, and I'm going to give a fairly high overview. We're not going to get into the weeds with any of these topics, but fairly high overview of what it kind of takes, what folks are looking for properties to be leased for each potential type of resource. So we're going to go ahead and kick things off with oil and gas. Every one of these sections is going to have a screen capture from our actual software and the data that you can get through a subscription. It's a Power Realty subscription, $25 a month, but you can get this access to this data across the United States through our web-based application. So a quick plug there. This is not a sales webinar at all. It's an educational webinar, but I did want you all to understand where this data and where these screen captures are coming from. That is something that you can access. So this picture that you're looking at here, you see these green dots and these green lines. Those are actually active oil and gas wells. As you can see in the aerial imagery, it's also sitting within a city. So this is a screen capture from Fort Worth, Texas. And you can see all of those little lines that are going out from a central location. Those are oil and gas wells that were drilled horizontally. Now, in order for that well to be drilled, a mineral owner had to lease their minerals so that energy company could come in and spend the money to extract those minerals and then that mineral owner would get compensated based on how much production takes place. So the big key here with oil and gas, and this is going to be oil and gas and mining, which we'll talk about a little later, they're kind of in their own classification, because the first bullet point there, you see mineral right ownership, it's a must. These are minerals that are being produced. Well, most folks don't understand the United States, it's an amazing place. We are the only country on the planet that us individuals can own the minerals and get compensation for those minerals. So that can create a very complicated thing called a split estate, where one individual can own the mineral rights and another individual can own the surface rights. That happens very commonly across the United States. But in order to lease your property for oil and gas, you do need to own the mineral rights, because that's essentially what you're leasing. You're not leasing the surface, you're leasing the subsurface. Secondly, you need to be located in what's called a sedimentary basin. Now, this isn't a basin that you would think of when you're driving along on the road and you see this big depression and maybe there's a lake or something there. That's not what we're talking about. These are areas throughout the United States where geologic records have been recorded in a stack of rock, meaning that a bunch of stuff that was once alive and died millions and millions of years ago has been captured and preserved in certain rock types, and that's been cooked through geologic processes. That turns into oil and gas. So oil and gas is essentially captured solar energy, which is captured nuclear energy from millions of years ago. But it needs to be located in one of those areas. Those are called sedimentary basins. You have major basins in Texas, West Texas, the Permian region, Colorado, the DJ Basin. Through the north central area, you have the Bakken region up in North Dakota. The Appalachian region on the East Coast is an enormous oil and gas province with enormous amounts of natural gas. But that's essentially where oil and gas is found, and that's where leasing takes place. So to that point, an area of economic oil accumulation, people would be very surprised to realize just how much oil and gas is actually in the ground. There's oil and there's natural gas all over the place. Now, whether or not you can drill and economically produce that is a different story. There's only a few places that it's actually economic. Obviously, if you're leasing your minerals, that's what people who lease those minerals are looking for, to be in an area where they can economically extract the resource. A really good indicator is if there's nearby oil and gas activity. If you have, I'm sure it's a very large group of landowners on this call. If you are a landowner and you have owned a piece of property that you feel that you own the mineral rights to, and you've had that property and it's been in the family for 100 years, and you've never had, and you are certain that you own the mineral rights. It's a big caveat. You're certain you own the mineral rights, and you've never had anybody ask you to lease or purchase those minerals. You're probably not in an area where you have economic oil accumulations, and you're probably not nearby an active oil and gas well. Another thing, obviously, to lease the land, it has to be unleased. So you can't continue if you already signed a lease. Now, those leases are not in perpetuity. Oil and gas leases, they are typically 5 to 7 years. If a well gets drilled on your property, then as long as that well produces in paying quantities, then it's going to hold the lease. If a well does not get drilled, that lease will likely expire and your property will become unleased. I know there's some people out there asking themselves, well, how do I know if I own the minerals or not? We have some webinars that go specifically into that, and Jordan and Michaela can send some links out of where you can look at those more detailed oil and gas, solar, wind type of webinars. But really quick, if you are in an area, if you lived in Fort Worth, if you had a house or you had a property in this area where there's all of this oil and gas production, and you've never received a letter asking to lease or purchase your property, or you've never received any royalty payments, you likely do not own the minerals. So, and we have some resources for that. There's 5 or 6 really quick questions that you can ask yourself and kind of determine whether or not you have minerals on your property. So shifting gears a little bit here, I won't say a little bit, a lot here, from oil and gas, everything's in the subsurface, got to drill through rock to go get it. We're going to talk about solar energy. This is a very important topic for all of the landowners here, because this is primarily driven from the surface owner themselves. Now you see the second bullet point there, it's preferable if they own the minerals because the mineral estate is the dominant estate. So if somebody owns the minerals and the surface owner is a different owner, the mineral owner has the right to extract those minerals under certain circumstances. So it's very helpful to own the minerals as well as the surface when it comes to solar. This map you're seeing here on the right, you can see here that there are, this is a solar farm. So this is an actual producing solar farm. And you can see some of these other features on the map. These red lines are transmission lines. This yellow dot is a substation, and these little yellow lines are distribution lines. There's some other things on the map that most people don't really consider. These red areas, these are areas where you have very high topography. So the slope of the land is very high. You also have these areas where you have the blue hash marks here. Those are flood zone. Those areas are not good for solar development. So there's a couple of very critical factors that makes a property good or bad for solar leasing. Number one is it in an area that's nearby major electrical infrastructure? And when we say that, is it nearby a substation? Is it nearby a transmission line? These transmission lines are these enormous electrical lines that you see that are held up by metal towers. They're not the little wood, the little ones that run along your street. Those little ones that run along the streets are these smaller distribution lines here. But how close is the property to this major infrastructure? Because that's essentially the entry point for those electrons to get into the grid, okay? The other major one is, can they actually build solar panels on it? Just because they're right next to a substation or transmission line doesn't necessarily equate that it could be a great spot, because you may not be able to build solar panels on it. So slope is taken into account. The property cannot be too hilly, can't have too much topography. It cannot be in a flood zone. There's a bunch of other different criterias. Now, we actually provide that information to you about your property for free at LandGate. If I was this landowner right here, if I was Julie Wynn Sneed, all I would have to do is click on that parcel, claim myself as the owner, and LandGate's going to provide all of the information. How close are you to the substation nearby? How close are you to the transmission line? How many acres can you actually put solar panels on? So we do all of those calculations and things for you. We provide those to you at no cost. A lot of questions always rise from folks who are interested in making money off solar is, how much acreage do they need? Now, this has changed quite a bit over the last 12 months, where previously you're going to be looking at 20 plus acres of buildable acres, not 20 gross acres for the overall parcel, but you can build on 20 acres. You can produce solar from 20 plus acres. Now, it can go all the way up to thousands of acres of parcels, and you can see that across the United States. Really, really cool to get into our app and just look around and see just how much energy is being produced by what resource and where. But getting back to the acreage minimums, there's now what's called community solar and behind the meter solar. So these are solar farms that are much smaller, still very large on a relative basis, still much larger than anything you would put on your rooftop or anything like that. But these types of solar facilities don't necessarily need to plug into an enormous, for a decent analogy, an enormous wall plug-in like a substation. They don't need to be plugged in at all, because they're going to plug in directly to a neighboring community, a building, a industrial facility, something. They're going to sell that power right on site. So that's called community or behind the meter type solar. And we've seen it's very common for sites down to 5 acres to be leased for solar energy.
I have one quick question
Yep,
in regards to solar. Connie asked, how close or far away from a substation is generally acceptable?
It's a very good question, Connie, and that's a relative scale. Depending on the size of the property, it depends. So if it's a very large parcel, and let's say 2,000 acre parcel, the distance getting close to that substation doesn't really matter as much because they can put so many solar panels on there, and it's going to be such a large project that the cost of putting in a new substation is minuscule relative to the overall size of the project. Now, if it's a 5 or a 10-acre parcel, you're going to need to be very, very close to either the substation or the behind the meter point where they're selling that power. Okay. So really, there is no, you need to be within this distance. We've seen, and this is a large landowner in Southeast Wyoming, utilize our marketplace. So real quick, just to let you all know how you can go ahead and start receiving offers for leases on all these resources. LandGate is a marketplace where you create your own listing, you host your own listing, you manage it, everything, delete it when you want, accept whatever you want, deny whatever you want. But a landowner utilized that feature in Wyoming, very large landowner, multiple thousands of acres. They were miles and miles away from a nearest substation. They had so many acres that it didn't really matter because they're going to build a brand new substation because the property's so large. So at any time, Connie, you know, if you have, and this is for anyone else, for folks that do subscribe to our platform, we are of service to those folks. So we're happy to sit down and look at a piece of property with someone and say, yeah, it's probably good for this or not good for that. So that's something that we also do.
We have one more, sorry.
Go ahead, Jordan. No, it's fine.
An anonymous attendee asked, how does the business model work with tax credits and SRECs? I've never understood how solar actually makes money.
It's a really good question. And that's a question for another webinar to get into the detail, but I'll give you a high level understanding. And I'm glad you asked that question because I blew right past that bullet point. The bullet point that touches on that is the fourth one here. It's in an area with favorable renewable energy incentives. Okay, so what that means is, you'll notice that I didn't put anything. It doesn't need to be in an area where the sun shines a lot, which is going to be different when we get to the wind section, which is different when we talk about oil and gas, where those resources are primarily produced, where an abundance of the resource exists. Solar is a little bit different. It's its own animal in that sense, where the renewable energy incentive that can be placed either at the state level, a local level, municipality, whatever it is, it can be based on the utility. They can incentivize solar developers to develop solar energy in areas where one might not think it's that feasible. The most highest concentration of solar panels per acre, as far as a state goes, is a state that doesn't get a whole lot of sunshine, and it's the state of Massachusetts, because years and years ago, they offer an incentive, a very large incentive, for folks that develop solar energy to go in there and build solar farms. Now, at the end of the day, a renewable energy credit is essentially a solar developer being able to produce electrons. Essentially, that's their product. And they can sell it for the wholesale cost of power, which is what you buy from a nuclear plant or natural gas plant or something like that. They get to sell it for that, but they also get an incentive. They get to sell it for an additional amount. And that's a very big economic factor in solar, as well with wind, is that additional amount that they can charge for the energy. At the end of the day, that REC is paid by the consumer. So I won't get into any more of that. Just giving you the facts of how that works. And again, we have some more detailed webinars about that. And even on our energy side, we get into very, very detailed specifics of pricing for electricity, RECs, how they all fold in. So that might be a good resource if you're really interested in that and want to learn more about the economics. We have some really, really good webinars for that. Let's see, we have, now we're going to shift gears a little bit here, wind energy. A little bit different here as far as what types of parcels people who are leasing this land are looking for. As you can see here, the scale is quite a bit different, right? We're looking at small, this is an interstate exit here. So this bar is showing 500 feet. This next bar is going to show 2 miles. So this wind farm, each one of these little triangles is a wind turbine. I believe this one is in eastern Colorado, right on the border between Colorado and Kansas. But this wind farm is 10, 15, 20 miles long, and that's very typical to see enormous projects. Now, the revenue is going to be distributed based on who gets wind turbines on their property, which is a lot different than solar. But some of the same aspects apply here. How close are they to electrical infrastructure? Now, it's not as critical because this farm is 15 miles across. At some point, this farm is probably going to cross a major transmission line, which you can see here. Here's a major transmission line. There's another one here. So it's not as critical that your individual tract is nearby a transmission line or a substation. What is more important is that it's lying in an area where the wind blows. Again, so that's a big kind of difference from solar. The resource has to exist there. So there's some, if you've ever been to Wyoming, it's a very windy place. That's a place that's a big target for a lot of wind developers. Down around West Texas, getting down closer to the border of Texas, very, very windy place, a lot of wind farms down there. So you really want to be in one of those areas where there is wind production, as far as wind blowing, but also have fairly large tracts of land. It's very, very difficult to build a wind farm of this scale and this magnitude the further east you go in the United States, because tracts are broken up very small. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so apologize for any coughing. I'm doing my best to withhold that. But as you can see here, these are very large tracts. This is a 2-mile scale bar here. So some of these circles, which are called center pivots, where we get a very large amount of our food in this country, these are up to, in some places, a mile across, most of the time, quarter mile or a half mile across. It's a very, very large tract if you would go to the East Coast, but you can put together a large wind project like this in the more Great Plains rural areas of the Rockies, and not have to have so much cost dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of landowners, whereas here they're probably dealing with a couple hundred landowners. Let's go ahead and see if there's a couple questions here. I'm going to save the questions to the end. Let's try to get through everything, and then we can go back through some questions. Jordan and Michaela, if you want to kind of highlight a few of the good ones that you think that you really want to make sure we address, please do so.
Yeah, I think, Craig, there is one question that I think goes along with what we've already discussed. Angela asked, do mineral leases interfere with land leases? So I guess going hand in hand with like the solar and wind we just discussed, if you want to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, certainly. And that's a good question. So they definitely can. So let's go back to this example of looking at Fort Worth. Now there's hundreds of areas just like this across the United States where there's active oil and gas drilling. You have different mineral owners, you have different surface owners, and that can cause a conflict. What has been very nice, and we've actually seen cooperation between oil and gas industry and those developers and solar and wind developers, is they're really aligned. At the end of the day, we need energy, and we need as much energy and as cheap energy as we can find. So we've actually seen them playing together as nicely as possible. And a good way for them to do that is what's called horizontal drilling, where it's not the days of the 60s, 70s, and 80s where every well that's being drilled has to have a drill site on top of it. If you look at this map again, you see all of these little triangles here. Well, that's where the actual surface location of these oil and gas wells are. So there's probably, looking at this, there's probably 10 to 20 oil and gas wells that spread all the way through this area, and they're all have their wellheads concentrated here. So that really helps with the communal development or co-development of oil and gas along with solar. So we've seen that happen where it does impact whether or not folks are really interested in putting solar or a surface lease. But it has, even moving forward, it's becoming far less of an impact. So I hope that helps answer that question. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anybody else has some more questions along those lines. Carbon credits is a very typical question that a lot of landowners ask about. Can they make money off of carbon credits? Is their site good for carbon credits? What drives the value of carbon credits on their property? Carbon credits, when we're talking about surface carbon offsets, is driven solely from the surface ownership. Okay, so it's whoever owns the surface. At the end of the day, the most important factor is something that we all learned about in our junior high and high school biology classes, is photosynthesis. How much carbon dioxide is being sequestered by the natural vegetation on that property? And not in some cases in the agriculture side, not even natural vegetation, but just crops, things like that, foliage. How much vegetation is on the property is a really, really good indicator of how good of a parcel is for carbon. And when I say good, how much revenue can be created. Carbon credits are paid based on the tons of carbon dioxide that can be sequestered out of the atmosphere. It's not based on an acreage, because the quality of the acreage varies greatly across the United States. This map here is showing you forest canopy density across the United States. It should shock no one that the Great Plains area is definitely not an area where you're going to go and hike through a forest. The climate's completely different, soil types are different, everything, right? But that all drives what types of carbon credits that you would qualify for. So areas where it's a very dark green, so you have the Gulf Coast region here. Obviously, if you live in those areas, it's very easy for you to grow a tree. Don't have to water it. They're grown naturally. If you lived where I grew up in this part of the country, we have to do everything we can to try to grow trees, and we water them and they still die. So we do everything we can, but what really drives it, how much precipitation do you get? What types of vegetation are there, and how much sun do you get? How much food do those plants have available to them? That's sunlight and carbon dioxide, and how much moisture is there to help those plants grow. So depending on where you are at in the country, really determines whether or not you have the ability to make revenue from those carbon credits. Along those lines, the size of the property also does matter. If you have, for instance, 200 acres of grassland in Western Kansas or Northern Texas or North Dakota, you're probably going to sequester, even though you have 200 acres, your property is going to sequester less carbon dioxide than a property that might only be 40 or 50 acres down here in the Gulf Coast, just because of the variables that are involved there. So there are some factors there. Obviously, if you have a large amount of timberland, it's a very, very good opportunity for you to make some carbon credits or make some revenue off of carbon credits. There's multiple different types of carbon credit programs. There's agriculture-based. So there's, when I say agriculture-based, farming, if they are changing their practices in a way that would allow additional sequestration of carbon dioxide, then they can enter a carbon credit program and get reward that way. Ranchers can do the same thing, reducing hoof counts, doing high intensity grazing, paddock grazing, things like that. From what we've seen and what I've personally seen is forestry seems to be the most ideal carbon credit program when it comes to landowners getting paid a fair shake in what is being produced on their property. One of the major ones is, and there's different, even within forestry, there's different types of carbon credit programs. What's called a deferred harvest program is very beneficial to landowners, especially if you're not planning on cutting your trees down in the first place. Things like that. So really not intensive as far as what encumbrances are put on the property carbon. That's why a lot of folks like them. You might have to change some operational practices, things like that, but you're essentially using the property very, very similarly than you were before. Whereas obviously with solar, it's a very intense thing where that property is going to be encumbered, and not really usable for a different purpose other than making solar energy, maybe some slight agriculture type things. But that's mainly the sole purpose for the property is producing solar energy.
We do have a quick question about
Okay.
carbon.
Okay.
Anna asked, who buys or leases the carbon credits? How can a landowner connect with these buyers?
So number one, our marketplace is made so that any landowner out there who knows nothing about solar, wind, carbon, oil and gas, mining, battery storage, we've provided a marketplace to you where by just simply making a listing, your property is going to get out in front of all of those industries and all of those professionals, and they're going to see the opportunity and they'll reach out to you directly. So that's probably the most important thing there is that's the best way to get out in front of these folks. As far as who pays you at the end of the day, it's not a carbon credit buyer. We go into great detail, and Jordan, maybe you can pull up that webinar where we talked about carbon credits. We go into great detail of carbon credits, the industry, how it functions, some good things about it, some shortfalls about it, and that would really be a great resource for you. But the landowners typically work with what's called a carbon developer. They will pay the landowner, they'll have a contract with that landowner, and then that developer turns it into a carbon credit and they put it into a registry, and then it's purchased out of the registry. It's a very complex process at this point. I really hope it becomes a little bit more streamlined and makes a little bit more sense for landowners moving forward. But again, we have some great resources for that to get into the details. This is one that a lot of battery storage is something that a lot of landowners probably have not heard of or considered. But if you've heard of solar, if it's in your area, this is right on your doorstep. Battery storage is going to be an enormous thing across the United States for landowners in particular. Now, these sites are much smaller, but they're critical for every solar farm that goes in, every wind farm that goes in, there's going to need to be battery storage to be able to store that energy. In a nutshell, what we're talking about battery storage, these are just enormous battery facilities that store energy when there is too much energy being produced. For instance, in California, massive amounts of solar panels that produce a ton of energy during the day. When people come home at night and the sun goes down, they're not producing any energy. So they need to get those electrons back into the grid. So this is an example from California. You can see active solar farms here, and you can see these little battery locations. These are just huge batteries. So during the day, when these solar panels are generating energy, when wind power is generating energy and it's not needed, rather than being wasted or curtailed, they'll put it into these batteries and wait until the grid needs it, and then they'll pull the electrons back on. So again, completely driven by the surface. Very similar. You want to be as close to infrastructure as you can, major infrastructure. But these resources are not required to be taking up massive amounts of land. We've seen 3+ acres very typically if you're in an area where battery storage is needed, up to 3 acres, and people are interested for the right site. So it's another really good way. If you have a site that you think could be good for that, very simple, it's free, no charge, no commission. Put that site, or you can list that site as a listing and put it up on our website, and it goes in front of all of the folks that are looking for those types of sites. One thing that's important, again, what I said, if you've heard about solar, you've received an offer for solar leasing, you've heard about it in your county, in your town, battery storage is coming right behind it, because battery storage is needed where the grid radically fluxes as far as the load, how much power is in the grid on a daily basis, where you have nuclear plants very, very constant, traditional power plants very, very constant. There's not a lot of variability. There's a massive amount of variability with wind and solar, which is why batteries will be really focused on areas where you see that fluctuation throughout the day. Again, you get access to all of that data using our LandGate tool. Another thing that's coming very, very quickly. Now this, for both battery storage and EV charging, this is really pushing the natural resource leasing aspect into cities, into large urban areas where traditionally folks haven't even considered, especially on the commercial real estate side of things, have not even considered energy for leasing. This is if I remember, yeah, so we're back down in Texas. This screen capture came from what used to be a small town called Denton, Texas, just northwest of Fort Worth and Dallas. Extraordinarily high growth in this area. And what LandGate has provided here is what's called an electrical vehicle corridor, where the government has incentivized companies to go in there and put electrical vehicle charging stations. You can see those charging stations here. And then LandGate actually has the locations of all the interstate exits. So combined with all of the energy infrastructure, you have these substations, transmission lines, road infrastructure where the charging stations exist. All of that data really helps provide folks what is a good spot and what's not a good spot. So you know, we've been going through, we started at very large tracts of land for solar, 20+ acres, started stepping down. Now EV charging, you don't need a whole lot of land. You just need the right types of parcels. You want to be close to an exit. You want to make sure that obviously it's not in a floodplain or anything like that. And you need about a half an acre of property. Do not need a massive parcel. In some cases, you can actually, if you have if there's a landowner or there's a commercial real estate developer on the call, you likely already have a site that can work for EV charging because it doesn't take a huge footprint. You have a strip mall or a storefront, something like that. Combining with this data, you can really find out if that's a good spot to put an EV charger in. What folks are really starting to look for now is areas where you're close to major infrastructure as far as electricity, major roads, exits. You want to be a fair distance away from the nearest, obviously the nearest EV charger that's in place. Same reason why you wouldn't want to build a gas station right next to another one. But what people are really also looking for are services that are around. So people are trying to put EV chargers in around where there's restaurants, there's parks, there's something for folks to do while they're sitting there for their 10 minutes to an hour, a couple hours to get their vehicle charged. So again, something to really keep in mind as you're moving forward. Shifting gears, again, we just went back to really, really small parcels, EV charging, something completely new. Shifting gears, but not really, because the only thing that's going to allow for the goals to be accomplished on EV charging, electrifying, generating the batteries and generating the electrons is going to come from the mining industry and where those minerals are actually going to come from. What you're looking at here on the right is actually a map of the bedrock underneath a bunch of different individual parcels. I believe this is in upstate New York, if I remember correctly. And on top of that, you're seeing mining locations where actual mines exist, where minerals were extracted. And you can see they're bounded based on what types of rock they're in. Most people don't understand that there's huge differences as you move across the land and what types of rocks are there. Again, this is data and information you get for free at LandGate, or you can get it across the country with our web app. But when it comes to mining, we kind of have to shift our brains back to oil and gas and back to the mineral rights. Do you own the minerals in the first place? You have to. Okay? If you do not own the minerals, then you likely are not going to be able to lease those. With mining, this is different than oil and gas, where in many cases, the surface ownership is going to need to be required at all. So it's very difficult to do a split estate type of thing for mining, just because many times the surface is encumbered and it's significant use of the surface as well. Like I said, you need to be within an ideal bedrock that has mineralization, that has the right types of minerals. And you can see on the map here, these green mining locations, very, very high concentration of mineralization here. So this parcel, probably very, very good. This parcel, very good. All of these parcels are great. This person or this person even though they're really close, stone's throw away from that mining location, may have zero opportunity for mining just because of the data that exists and that they don't have the same type of rock there. So really utilizing LandGate's data, you can understand if it's something that's a possibility. This is not something that has been a major aspect of landowners, land developers across the United States for a while, right? We haven't opened very many mines over the last 10 or 15, 20 years. If anything, we've been closing a lot of them. In my opinion, I think you're going to see a reversal of that just because we need massive amounts of lithium. We need massive amounts of critical minerals, cobalt, tantalum, tungsten, things like that, in order to have all of these electric cars and solar panels and things like that. So the United States has a very large amount of minerals, and we have a very large history of mining and refining those minerals. So I think, in my opinion, you're going to see a bit of a change, obviously in more rural areas. You know, we're not going to, companies are not going to go into urban areas and start mining. But I think you are going to see on the outskirts of cities, in areas where there is existing mineral concentrations, you're probably going to see a resurgence in mining, leasing, and things like that. But I think we are at the end of our presentation here. So I'll go back through, we'll answer some questions. Feel free to keep submitting them. And again, if I do not get to your question, we will email you back and we will do our best to answer. We'll do our best to answer those. So let me go through here. We're going to go ahead and we'll go ahead and touch on some specific landowners. I see Angela here has a question. She owns 100% of surface rights of 60 acres, but only a small percentage of the mineral rights, which are already leased. Okay, interested in leasing this surface area, but will the active mineral leases interfere with the land leases? It may. It just depends on whether the mineral tracts underneath your property have been developed or whether they were not developed. So when I mean developed, that means that there's likely going to be no more oil and gas drilling on that. They've drilled all the wells they can. They drilled every horizon that they can, and they're essentially done. They're just sitting there and extracting what the recovery factor for what's in the ground. If that's the case, you're likely going to be very clear to go ahead and start leasing things, because the likelihood of drilling location happening on that particular site is fairly low. Excuse me. If you're in more of an exploration type area, and you can find that out using LandGate, by seeing how many wells are around you, things like that. You're surrounded by oil and gas wells, and there's a likelihood that the minerals could be extracted. That may cause a solar developer to be a little bit cautious about that particular location. But again, happy to look at that in a little bit more detail with you. Looks like Howard has a question. 400-acre property in LandGate or in California on LandGate, and have been approached by outside LandGate, like to access LandGate solar developers. Away from me to do that. So Howard, if you've got a listing up there and it's a good listing, let us know. We try to promote all the good listings that we have, and making sure that everybody gets a look, or everybody who's interested in leasing in that area will look at your property. So if you could email that listing or email your property into Michaela or Jordan, we'll take a look at it, and that's something we can push out and make sure, hey, we'll let those energy folks know, take a look at this property. It is getting interest. So that's something we can do. Let me look at another one here. Jim's got a question. What is the average time of being contacted by a carbon developer? It really depends, carbon credits, and I'll touch on this a little bit. It really is the wild, wild west. There's companies that 2 years ago had all kinds of grand plans, and we're going to raise a bunch of money, and they don't exist today, 2 years later. So the market's changing very, very quickly of what types of credits do the registries, which the registries are being shaken up quite a bit too because of some questionable practices on their end, just because it's so new. It's very, very new, and there's a lot of money that's being involved with it. So there's going to be some complications there. But it really depends on the site. It's same as every other resource. If it's a good site, it's likely going to get some interest pretty quickly. If it's a site, and I'll use my own personal, one of my own personal properties, for instance, 40 acres of timberland in Colorado, not an enormous tract of land to make money on carbon credits. Yeah, it's 40 acres. It's a much larger tract of land than the vast majority of landowners in the United States have. But as far as the amount of tons of carbon credits that my property is sequestering, it's fairly low. I still have it listed. I'm likely not going to get anything, but it didn't cost me anything to list it either. So it really does, the amount of time, and this is for any resource, the amount of time it takes to be reached out to is really dependent on what quality the developer of any of those resources would require. We can't really force people to reach out anything. We try to promote things as best we can. But that's really, that's really the driving force, is the interest on the other side of the equation there. Okay, and Sergio's got a comment here. Hello, we're located in South Texas and able to bring hundreds of acres to the table. How can we reach you solar developers around this area? Thanks for joining the webinar, Sergio, and thank you for your comment and question there. That's very typical. There's a lot of folks in the United States that are very similar to you, where they may own a couple hundred acres, or they may have very good relationships with their property and the surrounding couple hundred acres involved with it. We've seen community leaders, we've seen landowner representatives, we've seen real estate agents represent multiple different properties in one listing. They put that up on the website, and if it's a good listing, it's going to move quickly. There's been, I would say, and I can't give any details, and we don't do that, but there's probably going to be close to 100,000 acres that will be leased through our platform. We don't lease, we're just a marketplace, but landowners who have listed their property, there's probably close to 100,000 acres that will be leased by the end of the year, closed and leased by the end of the year through the platform, just for solar. So it is a very, very active marketplace. It's growing very, very quickly. I mean, there's 300 plus people on this webinar alone listening, because this is a new value add to landowners that never existed before. It's a new product that didn't exist for folks. And I grew up in a very rural area of the United States, mostly farmers, ranchers. This is a tool that was built essentially for those types of folks, empowering those folks, giving them as much information. And then some multiple questions that I've seen here: how do you get your property in front of those folks? That's why we made the marketplace, is to get it out there, put it into a competitive market, and let folks who want to lease that property, let them all kind of compete in a fair market, the way everything else is bought, sold, traded. That's kind of the big deal about LandGate, is we've created that marketplace. It's never really existed. Long-winded response, but hopefully that adds some color. And then we've got Severiana. She has excuse me, fairly sizable property. There are windmills all around her, but the developer can't get to her because there's an easement across the adjoining farm. So that's a very, very good point to bring up. For all of these different resources, people have to understand that there can be layers of multiple easements, and not just for natural resources. There can be easements for a potential driveway. There can be easements for a power line. There can be all types of different easements. Essentially, when you're leasing your property, you're creating a new easement on that property. So that's something that it's always good to be aware of. And this is just for, regardless of how big or small your property is, it's always really, really good practice to understand what easements you have on your property. I think most people would be surprised to understand how many easements there actually are on their property. It was in the stack of papers when you bought your house, but if you're anything like me, you signed all 150 pages and didn't really read all of them either. So within there, there's disclosures of the easements. This, trying to lease your property, put a new easement on your property is no different than anything else. If there's already an encumbrance, an easement on the property, depending on what you're trying to do, it may make it difficult. Now, if you have an easement for, and this is a hypothetical situation, if you have an easement for an underground pipeline that's going through your property and you're interested in doing forestry carbon credits, well, that's probably something you can do in conjunction with one another, because the one does not disturb the other, right? So that's something that's up to the developers themselves. Again, LandGate and as far as a landowner goes, bringing that opportunity to the market and letting the market understand what's there that's a really important step, is just letting folks know. I got a fly that's attacking me, so I apologize. But that's a really important phase, to just get your property out there and in front of folks who want to interact with you. All right, let's see. I'm going to jump back through here. Let's see. Is it possible for you to share a list of energy developers using LandGate so I can be more proactive with my outreach? No, because we don't share users' information with other users' information. If you're using the platform, the only information that goes out on your listing is what information you want to be out there on your listing. So we can't do that. It's a good question. But again, if you have a piece of property, it looks good, you're nearby infrastructure, and it's not generating any traction, let us know, email us, and we will send out that listing to all of the users on the other side of the equation there. So feel free to just let us know. Carl has a question here. Do you ever offer consulting for landowners that are actively evaluating competing lease options for solar development? We do, yeah, we have an engineering side to the company where we will do appraisals and valuations for solar, wind, oil, and gas. It's not a major part of what we do anymore. We used to do that significant, very large amount, but we don't do that so much anymore. I would say, and those valuations, those engineered valuations can be quite expensive. I always say to folks that one of the very best ways to understand whether or not you're getting a deal, and this is a good deal, fair deal, and this is for anything, is to get as many offers as you can. See what the market's willing to do. I don't care if you are buying a used vehicle or you are leasing your property for solar battery storage. Get it out in front of everybody who wants to buy or wants to lease your property for those resources. And the best way to do that is put it into a competitive marketplace. We are the largest. We are very proud of it. Obviously, I'm proud and present co-founder of the company. Very proud of it. If there is really no other marketplace out there other than us, if there is, and you don't use us, I would suggest you find one. Get as many offers as you can. That way you know that you're getting a good deal. Nicole has a question here. The land I own is zoned residential. Will having a solar farm or battery storage be a challenge? It could be. That's going to come down to your local regulators and what they will allow to happen on the property. As with any other type of natural resource, there is pushback with solar, with wind, carbon, not so much carbon credits. It's very non-invasive. But for any other type of natural resource leasing, there are people that really like it and there are people that really don't like it. So a lot of these projects, and that's why solar leases are structured the way they are. And we have a very detailed webinar that kind of goes into those details of the different phases of a solar lease. But that's why, the first 3 to 5 years of a solar lease called the option period, and you don't get paid a whole lot because it's still a skeptical type scenario where it's not a guarantee the project's going to go through. There may not get the permit, may not get whatever it is needed, may not get their interconnection queue to get the project off the ground. So 1.6 acres is going to be pretty tough to get even community solar type of resources on your property. It's going to be pretty difficult there. But again, it's really based on what your parcel is and what's surrounding your parcel. So if somebody looks at it, you may only individually have 1.67 acres, but if you're in a really, really good spot and the only parcels that are around there are a couple acres, well, they'll still put a project in, but they'll just do a project with you and some of your neighbors to get it to the footprint that they need it to be. We have an anonymous here. Geothermal energy is starting to gain attention. Does LandGate's data cover geothermal? Do you have any information regarding leasing land for geothermal energy production? You're exactly right, anonymous, that geothermal is taking off. It absolutely is. And I'm a geologist by training. I have a couple geology degrees. I'm a huge fan of geothermal energy. It does create a lot of induced seismicity, so it does create a lot of earthquakes because you're moving significant volumes around in the subsurface, and it changes pore pressures, things like that. But it is a phenomenal energy source. There is, probably should have made this disclaimer early on. We're not advocates or defenders or anything of any individual energy source. All energy is good energy. Some make a lot more sense than others in certain areas. We are an all of the above type of company and a solution there. So geothermals are a very, very good one. We do have a lot of geothermal data that we have not pushed into the front end facing of our website. So this type of feedback is very, very good. There's a ton of things that we can do, and interest that we get back from folks in webinars and meetings and conferences kind of helps drive where we are going to go with the next round of development. Like I said, we have a lot of that data. We just haven't built some of the tools for it yet. So it's something that's on our pathway in the development is geothermal. We're knocking out mining, and we have some really, really exciting what's called indexes coming that will show you on a relative scale, 0 to 100, is your property in a dangerous area for pollution? Is it in a dangerous area for abandoned oil and gas wells? Things like that that are also coming, but geothermal would probably be coming at some point after that. And then we have about 1 minute left, and I'll touch quickly again. Lily asked, please explain community solar. So that's where we talked about community solar down here, 5+ acres. Community solar is different because it's not these enormous miles and miles of glass that you see. These are much smaller solar farms, again, much larger than what you would put on your rooftop or your garage, but still not the size of a 150 megawatt enormous solar farm that you'd see out in the deserts of California or something like that. The reason why they're called community solar, behind the meter solar, is because they essentially don't have to be plugged into the grid. That's these substations, huge transmission lines, these enormous plugins, if you will. They do not have to be plugged in there. They'll have a direct off-taker of that power. So community solar is used if there's a new suburb or a housing development that goes in, and they place aside 15 or 20 acres that they'll put solar panel on. They don't really care if they're close to a transmission line or a substation, because they're going to sell that power directly back to the subdivision that's there. So that's why it's called community solar, because the energy is essentially being purchased and consumed by the community there, or a industrial facility or something, or a building where they don't actually have to go into the grid and have it metered. So we're at the top of the hour here. I know I didn't get to a lot of your questions, and I do apologize for that. We will get these questions answered. We'll return them in an email. But once again, this was being recorded, so you will all get a recording of this email. It'll be sent out, and then please feel free to join additional webinars moving forward. We do this every couple of weeks, and it's always a different topic. So if there's additional topics you'd like to hear, email us, and you have the contact information there. Please email us some topics that you'd be interested in, and hopefully we see you again. So Thank you all for your time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.